Put the box down and step away from the porch. The command cracked through the quiet Boston afternoon so hard it seemed to rattle the maple leaves lining Ashcroft Lane. Marcus Ellison stopped halfway up the front walk, one hand under a taped moving box, the other steadying a framed photograph tucked against his chest. For a second, the whole street felt suspended, like the neighborhood itself had taken a breath and forgotten how to let it go. The house behind him was a red brick colonial with black shutters, neat white trim, and a brass number plate that still caught the late fall light. It was supposed to feel like a beginning. Instead, it already felt like an accusation. Across the street, Evelyn Parker stood at the edge of her driveway in a camel coat and polished riding boots, one hand pressed to her phone, the other lifted stiffly toward Marcus as if pointing at something dangerous. Her expression was not confused. It was certain. That was what landed first. Not fear. Not concern. Certainty. The kind that didn't ask questions because it had already decided the answer. Down the block, curtains twitched. A garage door paused halfway open. Someone watering a row of mums lowered the hose, but kept staring. The sound of tires rolling over pavement came fast, then faster, until two patrol cruisers turned onto the street with blue lights flashing against rows of tidy windows and carefully swept porches. Marcus slowly lowered the box onto the stone path. The cardboard scraped the concrete with a dry, tired sound. On the side, in thick black marker, someone had written kitchen. Inside the frame tucked under his arm was a photo of him and Nia on Revere Beach last summer, both laughing into the wind, her braids flying sideways, his tie gone loose after a city event he had left early just to make it in time for sunset. He looked down at it for half a beat, then set it carefully on top of the box. The front door of the house stood open behind him. Through it, he could see a narrow entry table, a rolled-up rug, and the warm amber spill of afternoon sun stretching across hardwood floors that had not yet learned their footsteps. This was supposed to be their home, the first real one in years. Not a downtown condo borrowed from duty. Not a furnished rental between transitions. A home. Somewhere his daughter could finally put posters on the wall without asking if they might have to leave in 6 months. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere steady. Then he heard the small voice behind him. Dad. Marcus turned. Nia stood just inside the doorway holding her stuffed bear by one arm, the plush fur worn flat in places from years of sleep and travel. Her sneakers were untied. Her eyes, dark and searching, moved from the police lights to his face and back again. Did we do something wrong? The question hit him deeper than Evelyn's voice, deeper than the flashing lights, deeper even than the eyes gathering from every window on the block. Marcus kept his face calm, but something in his chest drew tight. He took one slow breath, lifted his chin, and stepped just enough to place himself between his daughter and the street as the cruiser doors opened and the officers began walking toward him. The first officer up the walk was young, maybe early 30s, broad-shouldered beneath a navy jacket, his hand resting near his radio more from habit than threat, but the distance in his eyes was harder to ignore than the badge on his chest. He looked at Marcus, then at the open front door, then at the moving boxes scattered across the lawn as if trying to assemble a story that had already been written for him by someone else. Behind him came a second officer, older, with a lined face and a measured step, the kind of man who had spent enough years in uniform to know that a quiet street could still hide the ugliest kinds of assumptions. Neither of them spoke right away. The cruisers kept flashing, washing the brick facade in blue and white, turning the polished windows of neighboring homes into mirrors of tension. Marcus could feel every set of eyes on him. Not just Evelyn Parker's hard stare from across the hedges, but the invisible gaze of the whole block. It was in the stillness behind the curtains, the silence on the porches, the way the air itself seemed to lean toward judgment. Nia shifted in the doorway behind him, and he heard the soft drag of her bear's paw against the wood floor. He wanted to turn, to tell her everything was fine, to give her the kind of easy reassurance children deserved, but the moment did not belong to comfort. It belonged to restraint. The younger officer cleared his throat. Sir, we received a call about a possible break-in in progress. His tone was professional, but the words landed cold all the same. Possible break-in. Marcus looked once at the brass house key still sitting in the lock where he had left it after carrying in the last lamp, then at the legal folder on the passenger seat of his SUV parked by the curb, then back at the officer. "This is my residence," he said, calm and even. His voice did not rise. It did not harden. It stayed level, anchored, almost quiet enough to disappear if no one cared to hear it. Across the street, Evelyn folded her arms as though she had done something noble. Her blonde hair moved slightly in the wind, but the rest of her held still, chin lifted, mouth set in the tidy line of someone who believed order looked exactly like her and danger did not. Marcus had met that kind of certainty before. In city meetings. In closed rooms with polished tables. In neighborhoods where respect was offered like a password and suspicion came free. The older officer glanced at the moving van parked half a block down, then at the stack of flattened boxes by the garage. "Do you have identification, sir?" he asked. There it was. Not a shout. Not an insult. Just procedure wrapped around humiliation so neatly it could pass for routine. Marcus nodded once. "In my jacket pocket. Left side." He moved carefully, slow enough that even the dry leaves skittering over the walkway seemed louder than his hand brushing the fabric. He pulled out his wallet and held it out. The younger officer stepped forward and took it, flipping it open under the pulse of the cruiser lights. For a moment, his face stayed blank. Then his eyes flicked back to Marcus. Not recognition yet. Just the first small crack in certainty. Behind Marcus, Nia's voice came again, softer this time. "Dad, are they mad at us?" He closed his eyes for the smallest fraction of a second. When he opened them, his expression had not changed, but something in it had deepened, something quiet and immovable. "No, sweetheart," he said without turning around. "They are just trying to understand what should have been clear from the beginning." The younger officer held the wallet a second longer than necessary, his eyes moving from the driver license to the address on the house, then back to the man standing in front of him with that same impossible calm. Marcus did not shift. He did not argue. He did not fill the silence, just because the silence had turned hostile. He stood on his own front walk in a charcoal sweater and work gloves, the cold air touching the edges of his close-cropped hair, while the whole street waited for him to become the version of himself they were clearly more comfortable believing in. Across the lawn, Evelyn Parker took one careful step forward, her voice smooth now, polished for an audience. "Officer, I saw him carrying things inside for at least 20 minutes before I called." He looked around first. He kept checking the street. Marcus let the words pass through the air without turning toward her. He knew exactly what she meant. Not what she said. What she meant. In neighborhoods like this, a black man looking both ways before unloading boxes did not read as cautious. It read as suspicious. A father checking the street before bringing his daughter into a new house did not read as protective. It read as if he was afraid of being seen. And maybe he had been. The older officer took the license from his partner and studied it with a narrower, more thoughtful gaze. "Marcus Ellison," he said quietly, almost to himself. The name seemed to touch something in his memory, but not enough yet. Not enough to alter the shape of the moment. Behind Marcus, Nia stepped 1 inch closer to the threshold, still clutching her bear, the tip of one sneaker resting on the brass strip between the foyer and the porch. Her small denim jacket was half-zipped, and one braid had come loose near her cheek during the move. She looked tired. The kind of tired only children get after a long day of pretending they are excited so their parent does not feel guilty for how hard the change is. Marcus felt that detail like a weight. He had promised her this move would be different. Better school. Bigger room. A yard with enough space for spring flowers and summer chalk drawings. A neighborhood where she could ride her bike. In circles until the streetlights came on. He had not told her that sometimes the hardest part of arriving was not the boxes or the paperwork or the new locks. Sometimes it was the way people looked at you when they thought you had arrived somewhere they had already decided was not meant for you. The younger officer glanced toward the open front door. "Sir, do you have closing documents or anything with your name on it inside the house?" he asked. Again, the tone stayed polite. That was what made it sting. Politeness could still humiliate when it required proof of belonging from one person and blind trust from another. Marcus nodded toward the entryway. Folder on the console table. Blue leather binder. The officer hesitated, then stepped inside. His boots crossed the threshold carefully, as if entering a museum or a mistake. From where Marcus stood, he could see the sunlight still stretched in a long golden band across the floorboards, warming the edges of stacked books, a lamp without its shade, and a pair of Nia sneakers kicked beside the wall. Small signs of life. Small signs of claim. Small things that should have settled this before it ever began. Evelyn folded her arms tighter. You can never be too careful these days, she said, louder now, offering her fear to the neighborhood like it was public service. That was the first moment Marcus turned to look at her. His face remained composed, but his eyes held something deeper than anger. It was disappointment sharpened by familiarity. He had seen that sentence dressed in different clothes his whole life. Different city, different street, same meaning. Before he could answer, the younger officer reappeared in the doorway holding the binder open in both hands, and the expression on his face had changed. The younger officer stopped at the edge of the porch with the blue binder open in his hands, and for the first time since the cruisers had turned onto Ashcroft Lane, the rhythm of the scene changed. It was subtle at first, almost invisible, but Marcus felt it all the same. The man's shoulders, which had been squared with official certainty a moment earlier, no longer held the same rigid line. His eyes moved once more across the documents inside the binder, slower now, more carefully, as if he were no longer looking for a reason to question Marcus, but trying to understand how the situation had gone so wrong so fast. The older officer took a step closer and glanced down at the page. Closing statement. Property deed. Wire confirmation. Insurance papers. Every sheet carried the same name, the same address, the same clean proof that should have ended the moment before it ever reached a siren. Neither officer spoke right away. The wind moved through the trees with a dry whisper, and somewhere down the block a dog barked once, then fell silent. Even the neighborhood seemed to realize something had shifted. Marcus remained where he was, hands relaxed at his sides, his body still angled just enough to shield Nia from the sharpest part of the street's attention. She had not moved from the doorway. She watched everything with that wide, quiet focus children have when they understand more than adults hope they do. Evelyn Parker, however, was not ready to let the scene release her. Well, she called from her driveway, trying to keep her voice crisp and composed. What is going on? It was not a question asked in humility. It was the demand of someone used to being answered. The younger officer looked toward her, then back at Marcus, and there was a flicker of discomfort in the pause that followed. The documents show he is the legal owner of the property, he said at last. The sentence landed over the street like a stone dropped into still water. The reaction was immediate, though no one said much. A curtain on the second floor of the house next door fluttered shut. The man by the mums suddenly remembered the hose in his hand and pointed it toward the flower bed without really watering anything. A woman across the street stepped back from her front window, embarrassed by her own curiosity. But Evelyn did not retreat. Instead, she lifted her chin higher, as if being wrong was merely an inconvenience, not an indictment. I was only trying to protect the neighborhood, she said. You cannot blame me for being cautious. Marcus turned fully toward her then, and the motion was so calm it carried more force than anger would have. His expression did not harden. It quieted. That was worse. It made the street lean in. Caution asks questions, he said, his voice low and steady. Assumption calls the police before the moving truck is even unloaded. Evelyn's face tightened. Not with guilt. Not yet. With resistance. The older officer looked down, as if the words had found their mark in more than one place. The younger one handed the binder back to Marcus, careful now, almost respectful, and Marcus accepted it with the same even restraint he had carried from the beginning. He could have humiliated her then. He could have let the silence expose her in front of the whole block and left it there like broken glass. But that was never the kind of man he had taught himself to be, and certainly not the kind of father he wanted his daughter to remember on the first day in their new home. He tucked the binder under one arm and reached back without looking. Nia's small hand slipped into his almost instantly, warm and trembling. The contact steadied something in him. Then, from the front seat of the second cruiser, a radio crackled sharply, followed by a voice that changed everything. Unit 12, confirm location. Deputy Commissioner Rivera is en route to greet Chief Ellison on site. The words from the radio did not just break the silence. They split it wide open. For one suspended second, nobody on Ashcroft Lane seemed to understand what they had heard, as if the title itself had arrived too large for the street to hold. Deputy Commissioner Rivera, en route to greet Chief Ellison. The younger officer froze beside the porch steps, his hand still half lifted from returning the binder. The older officer blinked once, then twice, and his entire posture changed with a speed that would have looked almost mechanical if it had not been so deeply human. His shoulders straightened, his chin lifted, his face lost the neutral haze of procedure and took on the unmistakable weight of recognition. He turned toward Marcus again, really toward him this time, not toward the accusation, not toward the paperwork, not toward the scene Evelyn Parker had built with a phone call and certainty. Marcus felt Nia's fingers tighten around his hand. The late afternoon wind moved a loose strand of hair across her cheek, but she did not brush it back. Her eyes stayed locked on the officers, then on her father, as if she were trying to read from his face what the rest of the street had failed to understand from the beginning. Across the road, Evelyn's expression finally shifted. It was not dramatic. It did not need to be. The change came first in her mouth, where the practiced firmness loosened into something uncertain, then in her eyes, where confidence gave way to a slow and terrible recalculation. Her arms, which had been folded so tightly across her coat a moment earlier, fell apart at the elbows. The phone in her hand lowered by 2 inches. Then 4. She looked around the street as if hoping to find someone else still standing inside the version of events she had created. But the street had already moved on without her. The younger officer stepped back from Marcus as though distance itself had become a form of respect. "Chief," he said, almost under his breath, and the word carried more embarrassment than volume. Marcus did not answer right away. He stood with the binder tucked under one arm, his daughter's hand in his, the front door of his new house open behind him, and let the moment settle where it belonged. Not because he wanted to embarrass anyone, because truth had finally entered the scene, and truth often needed a second to make itself visible. The older officer touched the brim of his cap with a small, controlled motion. "Sir," he said, voice lower now, stripped of its earlier distance. "I apologize. We were responding to the call." Marcus gave a slight nod. "I know," he said. And he did know. That was part of what made the whole thing so heavy. He knew what dispatch heard. He knew how calls were framed, how urgency got built out of tone and implication, how suspicion could travel faster than facts when certain voices delivered it. He had spent years inside the machinery of that reality, years studying it, confronting it, trying to change it from within without letting it harden him into someone smaller than his own principles. A third vehicle turned onto the street then, not a cruiser but a dark city sedan with official plates that caught the dying light. It rolled slowly to the curb, and every eye on the block followed it. The neighborhood had gone so quiet Marcus could hear the soft grind of its tires over fallen leaves. The driver stepped out first, then rounded the front bumper to open the rear door. Deputy Commissioner Elena Rivera emerged in a long charcoal coat, silver at her temples catching the light, her presence calm but unmistakable. The officers on the lawn reacted instantly. Both straightened fully. The younger one looked like he wanted the earth to open beneath his shoes. Evelyn Parker took one involuntary step backward onto her own grass. Rivera's gaze moved from the cruisers to the officers, from the officers to Marcus, and then finally to the woman across the street whose face had gone pale under the fading sky. Marcus looked down at Nia, gave her hand one gentle squeeze, and then lifted his eyes back to the street, just as Deputy Commissioner Rivera spoke the first words that would force everyone there to reckon with exactly who he was. Deputy Commissioner Rivera stopped at the edge of the walkway, the hem of her charcoal coat moving lightly in the cold breeze, and for a moment she said nothing at all. Her silence did more than a raised voice could have done. It pulled the whole street into stillness and held it there. The cruiser lights still flashed across the brick walls and polished windows, but now the color seemed drained of urgency, reduced to a nervous echo of a mistake that had already become impossible to hide. Rivera's eyes rested first on Marcus, then on Nia, then on the open front door behind them where unpacked boxes and a rolled rug waited in a band of warm gold light. When she finally spoke, her tone was calm, almost gentle, but every word landed clean. "Commissioner's office sent me to welcome Chief Ellison and his daughter to the neighborhood," she said. No one moved. The sentence hung over Ashcroft Lane like a church bell after the strike, vibrating through every porch, every window, every trimmed hedge and swept stoop. Nia looked up at her father with a soft, startled expression, not because she did not know who he was, but because children never fully understand how large a parent's title can feel in other people's mouths. Marcus gave her hand another quiet squeeze. He had never wanted the badge to enter her life as a shield, and certainly not as a lesson. Yet here they were. Across the street, Evelyn Parker had gone completely still. The confidence that had carried her through the phone call, through the sirens, through the assumption that she was protecting something valuable, had slipped from her face all at once. She looked smaller now, though nothing about her clothes or posture had changed. It was not size she had lost. It was certainty. The younger officer lowered his eyes. The older one stood with the rigid attention of a man who knew the line between procedure and failure had just become painfully clear. Rivera glanced toward them, and the air seemed to tighten. "Is there a reason," she asked evenly, "that the new chief of Boston Police was being questioned on his own front lawn while his daughter stood in the doorway holding a stuffed bear?" No one answered right away. There was no good answer. Only versions of the same bad truth. Marcus could feel the entire block waiting for him to speak, to claim the upper hand now that the power in the scene had turned so completely. But the anger rising in him was not sharp. It was old. It had edges worn smooth by repetition. He had felt it in school hallways, in college parking lots, outside city buildings, in neighborhoods where his suit never seemed expensive enough, and his calm never seemed innocent enough. What hurt most was not Evelyn's call. It was Nia's question. "Dad, did we do something wrong?" That question would stay with him longer than any apology. The wind pressed softly against the trees, and one brown leaf landed near the box-marked kitchen at his feet. Marcus looked down at it for a second, then up again. "No one here needs to be humiliated," he said quietly. His voice made the whole block lean closer. "But everyone here needs to understand what happened." He turned just enough so Nia could see his face, then lifted his eyes toward Evelyn. There was no cruelty in his expression, only a steadiness so complete it made her lower her gaze for the first time. "My daughter's first memory of this home," he said, "should not have been fear dressed up as neighborhood safety." For a long moment, no one on Ashcroft Lane seemed able to look directly at anyone else. The street that had felt so certain a few minutes earlier now carried a different kind of weight, the kind that settled into the chest and stayed there. Evelyn Parker stood near the edge of her driveway with both hands hanging stiffly at her sides, her phone no longer lifted like a badge of authority, but resting useless and dark against her coat. The late afternoon light had thinned to a pale gray wash over the row of houses, and the first hint of evening made every porch lamp look warmer than it had before. Marcus could hear the faint rustle of packing paper from inside the house, where one of the open boxes had shifted in the breeze coming through the doorway. Such a small sound, but it grounded him. It reminded him what this day had been meant to be before suspicion arrived, and tried to rename it. Deputy Commissioner Rivera took one measured step back, giving the moment room to belong to the people who had created it. The officers remained still. The younger one looked as though he wanted to speak, and did not yet know how. The older one stared down at the walkway, his jaw tight with the kind of regret that comes too late to prevent harm, but not too late to reveal character. Nia stayed tucked against Marcus's side now, one hand around his fingers, the other clutching her bear against her jacket. She looked from face to face, reading the adults the way children do when they are searching for truth beneath tone. Evelyn finally swallowed and lifted her eyes. When she spoke, the sharpness was gone. "I did not know," she said. The words were quiet, almost fragile, but they did not travel far enough to soften what had already happened. Marcus studied her for a second. He saw the embarrassment, yes, the fear of being judged by the same witnesses she had hoped would silently affirm her. But beneath that, he saw something more useful than shame and more difficult than apology. He saw recognition. Not complete, not comfortable, but real. "That is the point," Marcus said. His voice remained low, steady enough that people had to listen rather than react. "You did not know me. You did not ask me. You saw a black man carrying boxes into a house on this street, and your first instinct was not welcome. It was removal." No one interrupted him. Even the wind seemed to have eased. Evelyn's face tightened, then softened, as if each word was undoing some private defense she had depended on for years. "I thought I was being careful," she said, and this time the sentence sounded less like an excuse than a confession. Marcus nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. "A lot of people call it that," he said. They call it caution when it feels respectable. They call it concern when it sounds polite. But my daughter still heard sirens before she heard hello. Nia lowered her eyes at that, and Marcus felt her move a little closer. Across the lawn, Evelyn's gaze followed that small motion, and for the first time she seemed to understand the size of what she had done. Not to his career, not to his image, to a child. Her mouth parted slightly, then closed again. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled at the edges. "I am sorry," she said. "I am truly sorry." Marcus let the apology stand in the cold air between them. He did not rush to accept it, and he did not reject it. He only looked at her with the same calm that had carried him through the sirens, the questions, the eyes at the windows. Then he glanced down at Nia, brushed his thumb gently across the back of her hand, and lifted his face to the quiet street, as if deciding what kind of ending this moment deserved. Marcus stood in the cooling air with the blue binder tucked beneath his arm and his daughter's hand folded into his, and when he finally spoke again, the street listened in a way it had not listened before. There was no anger in his voice now, only a quiet clarity that made every porch and window feel suddenly too close to hide behind. "An apology matters," he said, looking at Evelyn, then at the officers, then briefly at the row of houses that had watched him be turned into a question on the first afternoon he was supposed to become a neighbor. But apology is only the beginning. It is what comes after that tells the truth. Evelyn lowered her head a fraction, not in defeat, but in the uncomfortable posture of someone hearing herself described more accurately than she had ever allowed. The younger officer shifted his weight, his face still flushed with embarrassment, and the older one removed his cap for a second, holding it at his side, as though the gesture might offer the respect the moment had lacked. At the start, Deputy Commissioner Rivera remained quiet, letting Marcus shape the scene, letting the authority he carried come not from rank, but from restraint. Nia leaned lightly against his side. The porch light had clicked on behind them without anyone noticing, filling the doorway with a soft amber glow that spilled over the threshold and touched the edge of the box-marked kitchen. The framed beach photo still rested on top of it, glass catching the light in a thin, trembling line. Marcus glanced down at it for a brief second and saw the version of this day he had wanted, unpacking dishes, ordering takeout, letting Nia choose which room would hold her bookshelves. Instead, she had learned something harder. He drew a slow breath. "I am not interested in embarrassing anyone," he said. "I am interested in making sure my daughter grows up in a city where people understand the difference between danger and discomfort." Those words landed deeper than anything that had come before. Evelyn looked up then, and in her eyes he saw the first real fracture in her self-protection. Not because he had exposed her, because he had refused to punish her the way she had expected powerful men to punish. He had left her alone with something heavier than public humiliation. He had left her with herself. Her voice came smaller this time. "I cannot take back the call," she said, "but I can tell you I was wrong." Marcus nodded once. "Then start there," he replied. "Not with me. With the part of you that saw my presence before you saw my humanity." The officers kept their eyes lowered. Somewhere down the block, a front door opened and closed softly, as if one of the watching neighbors had finally decided they could not keep observing from a distance without feeling part of what had happened. Deputy Commissioner Rivera stepped forward just enough to stand beside Marcus rather than in front of him, and the gesture changed the tone of the whole street. It was no longer a scene of exposure. It was becoming a scene of accountability. Marcus looked down at Nia, whose tired face had softened a little under the porch light. "Sweetheart," he said gently, "go inside and put your bear on the counter for me." She hesitated only a second, then nodded and slipped her hand from his. He watched her small figure disappear into the warm house, her sneakers tapping softly across the hardwood, and when he turned back to the street, his expression had changed. It was not colder. It was steadier. "Tomorrow," he said, meeting Evelyn's eyes, "you can come over and introduce yourself the way neighbors are supposed to." Evelyn blinked, stunned by the grace in the invitation. Marcus let the silence sit for one beat longer, then added, "But tonight, I think this street has already learned enough to remember." Nia's footsteps faded softly into the house, and for the first time since the sirens had cut across Ashcroft Lane, the street seemed to remember how to breathe. The cruiser lights were switched off one by one, and with each pulse of blue that disappeared, The neighborhood looked less like a scene and more like what it had been pretending to be all along. A place where people wanted to believe they were decent. The cold had deepened now, settling over the hedges and brick steps, silvering the edges of parked cars and bare branches under the first low glow of evening. Marcus remained on the walkway for a moment longer, the binder still under his arm, the front door open behind him, warm light reaching past his shoes and onto the stone. Deputy Commissioner Rivera gave him a small nod, not formal now, but human. "Welcome home," she said quietly. The words landed gently, and that gentleness did more to steady him than the titles or the apologies ever could. Marcus returned the nod. "Thank you," he said. The officers murmured their apologies once more before stepping back toward their cruisers, their movements careful, subdued, shaped now by a humility that had not been present when they arrived. The younger one paused beside the curb and looked back as if he wanted to say something larger, something that could undo the first impression he had carried onto the lawn, but in the end he only lowered his gaze and got into the car. It was enough. Not because the moment was fixed, but because pretense had finally been stripped away. Across the street, Evelyn Parker still stood near the edge of her driveway, though the stiffness had gone out of her posture. She looked older somehow, not in years, but in awareness. The polished certainty that had framed her so completely at the start of the afternoon was gone, and what remained was quieter, less flattering, but more honest. Marcus looked at her one last time. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then stopped. Some truths did not need more words. Some shame, when it was real, learned to stand without performance. Marcus turned away first. Not as dismissal, as mercy. He stepped up onto the porch, lifted the framed beach photo from the top of the kitchen box, and crossed the threshold into the house. Inside, the air smelled like cardboard, pine cleaner, and the faint sweetness of the cinnamon gum Nia had been chewing in the car. She was standing in the middle of the living room beside a stack of unopened boxes, her bear now sitting carefully on the counter, just as he had asked. She looked small in the wide room, but not frightened anymore. Just tired. Marcus set the photo down on the mantel and walked over to her. "Come here," he said softly. She stepped into his arms without a word, and he held her there in the warm light while the last sounds of the street faded outside. Through the front window, he could see the cruisers pull away at last, their tires rolling quietly over the darkening road. No sirens now. No spectacle. Just a slow departure into the evening. Nia leaned back enough to look up at him. "Are we still staying?" she asked. Marcus smiled then, small but certain, the kind of smile that had been earned the hard way. He brushed a loose braid from her cheek and glanced around the room at the boxes, the bare walls, the lamp waiting to be assembled, the life waiting to begin. "Yes," he said. "We are home." Outside, the street fell still. Inside, the porch light glowed against the window glass, and in that quiet house, justice did not sound like triumph. It sounded like a father locking the front door, turning on the kitchen light, and choosing peace anyway.